Thank you very much, Stefano. Thank you to everyone here for welcoming us, new members. I think the best place for me to start this self-presentation is in a little room in 1986 in Cambridge University. I was a third-year undergraduate student of manufacturing engineering at the time, and I had to do a course called Social Dimensions of Technology. As a result, I read an article entitled Engineers and the Work People Do, written by Howard Rosenbrock, who at that time was the professor of control engineering when there was only one professor in every department at that time in UK universities. So he was the professor, the top dog of control engineering at University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. And I often tell people that reading this article was my Damascus Road experience. Because it really changed the direction of my life, reading this article. Or another way of putting it would be to say I felt like I was looking through a lens. We've got our great photographer here, a lens that was fuzzy. And reading the article, he turned the focus and I suddenly saw what was going on. And I realized that I'd been uneasy about something and he articulated it for me. So I'd just like to say something about what it was. He starts his article by saying, what I'm going to describe in this article you will find very ordinary, but by the end of it, I hope I will have been able to convince you that it's very strange. And he proceeds to describe a rather normal production line at that time. This is the 1980s. They're producing light bulbs. Later on in the article, you find out it's in Hungary, a so-called worker state, but we don't know it at this time. Now, most of the production system is mechanized, but there are 4 jobs being done by women. One of them involved picking up a piece of wire and inserting it into the coil of the lamp bulb every 3.5 seconds. And that's what she did for the whole of the day. That was her job. Now, later in the article, he talks about how people need jobs. But at that point, he says, isn't this a terrible thing to ask somebody to do? Just to make this small movement every 3.5 seconds. So he suggests we could give this as a design problem to students, and he discusses how you might design this to take this job away from the woman, to mechanize it. Now he says at some point, you might find a student that's more thoughtful, who might say, wait a minute, it's great fun for us to design a machine, but it's very expensive. It's much cheaper if we buy a robot, because already in the 1980s, robots were being mass-produced. So then he says, now that's interesting, because then that student's thinking about this problem not only as a technical problem, but also as an economic problem. Just think about this problem in a bigger frame. But he says, still, if you were a good engineer, you'd think, if we spent that money on a robot, okay, it's not as much as designing our own machine, but still, we invested money in this thing. We should try to make use of the amazing capabilities it has as much as possible. So you might start thinking how you could redesign the system around the robot. So I think you can see where this is going. He says, isn't it interesting that nobody thinks about doing this when the woman's doing the job? And then he has his killer move, which is to say, if engineers could think about people as if they were robots, they'd give them more human work to do. And this just absolutely changed me reading this. I got on a train and went up to Manchester. I said to him, I found him, I said to him, your paper is the best thing I've read. Please, can I work with you? And he said, well, I'm sorry, I'm retiring, but there's this project and that project and there's the other project. And why don't you stay in the university where you are? Because there's somebody who's interested in this topic. So I ended up doing that. I got involved in an EU-sponsored ESPRI project on human-centered technology. And really, since then, that's what my life has been about. Trying to connect these technical resources, these amazing technical resources that we have in the world today, with a more life-centered vision. Of course, that means human beings, but it also means living world as a whole. Flourishing of human beings, the flourishing of the world. So then I started to do this doctorate. And if you're going to do something on human work, because the idea was to work on human-centered technology, I had to say something about, well, what does it mean to be human? What is work and all this stuff? So everybody else in my department was using Frankfurt Critical Sociology, which is pretty good stuff. I mean, very interesting. I read it, I thought it was interesting. I talked to my father about my project. Now, my father had become a Catholic when he was 27 years old. So he had read a lot of things that those of us who have been brought up Catholics never read. He said to me, well, that's interesting. Why don't you read Rerum Novarum? You might find something in it. Well, I didn't even know there was a thing called Rerum Novarum. So anyway, he gave me his 1954 CTS battered up little pamphlet, and I read it. And it's a very funny story about when I read it, but I can tell you about that another time. But anyway, I read it, and I thought, well, it's a bit old-fashioned, but there's something in this. So I started reading some other things. And then I read Laborum Exercens. Laborum Exercens had just come out a few years before I started my doctorate. And I just thought, I can use this in my thesis. This is fantastic. So what happened? I told my supervisor, I'm going to use this stuff. So nobody said I couldn't use it. Nobody stopped, but they just stopped talking to me. Nobody discussed my thesis. My thesis director would send me back all the chapters with lots of comments on, except for this chapter, which never had a single comment on it. And the only thing that anybody ever said to me about this was my supervisor, 1 month before I had the final submission. She said to me, I'm glad you've got that chapter in. And that's the only thing anybody ever said to me about it, including the defense. We got to the defense, and so I walk into the room, and there's the big dais, and all the examiners are there with my thesis in front of me. Now, 3M had just come out with the Post-it note, so everybody's using Post-it notes. So I walk into the hall, and I see my thesis on the dais, and it's a forest of Post-it notes. There's so many of them, and that just scared me to see all those Post-it notes. So I kind of lost my nerve when I went there. Anyway, they asked me questions about the first chapter, then they get to the second chapter, which is the second chapter had stuff about the social teaching in it. And they said to me, well, your position in chapter 2 is very interesting, but it's held by a statistically small number of people. They'd obviously prepared this sentence beforehand. And so if I'd had my nerve, I would have stopped them and said, excuse me, what do you mean statistically? But anyway, I didn't stop. So anyway, I realized with that experience, I found this amazing thing I wanted to do, and I couldn't do it there because you can't grow on your own. So I was looking around for other ways to go forward. In the meantime, I'd started going to the Dominican house, and with the Dominicans, I found I could talk about the CST and about my project and everything else. So I ended up joining the Dominicans. Of course, I had to think, I might have to give this all up. Maybe they'll send me to do something completely different, but it was worth it. So anyway, in the end, they sent me to the Faculty of Social Sciences in Rome. It was the perfect training for this because our work is about connecting CST and ethics and what I've later learned as natural law, virtue, common good, with these technical subjects. That's basically what we're doing in this faculty. I took a year out before I went to the novitiate. I went in 94 when I was 30 years old to join the Dominicans. And I went to the United States for a year, where I started working on a book with Michael Norton at University of St. Thomas, which became Managing as if Faith Mattered, Christian Social Principles in Modern Organization. I also then, thanks to Stefano, ended up directing a master's program in corporate social responsibility because he said that's the best thing to work on at this time. We started in 2004. And all the time we were trying to give a deeper grounding to CST because we knew what was going to happen to CST. It's what has happened to CST, is that people saw it was just a fig leaf for covering over doing the same thing. And so people have shifted on to another term now. First it was shared value. Now everybody's sustainable. Let's hope sustainability, because there's the real agenda behind climate change, could be a bit more solid. But, I think the jury is still out. The last thing I'd say about, or maybe two last things. Last thing about the kind of history is that the financial crisis changed everything for me. After financial crisis, I went from being a nobody to being a somebody, a kind of a guru. And I got involved in this project called Blueprint for Better Business, which is talking to the FTSE 100 companies in London. And I would go, and they were like amazed at what I was talking to them about. Of course, it was just all the old stuff, but they didn't know anything about it. And the last thing to say is I'm very glad to be here as the successor to Padre Utz, because I think Utz is one of the key figures in the history of this academy, but also for the future of the work that we can do together here. Thank you very much.